Still with me in the studio, France 24's Tom Burgess-Watson and Annette Young from our International Affairs Desk. Annette, this plane came down a few hours ago in the French Alps, so about 2,000 metres in altitude. So, of course, this is going to be a very tricky search and rescue operation.
It certainly is, Claire, and I think the most important thing, of course, now is to find that black box, to find out exactly what happened. Now, we're getting reports that debris has been found scattered among a number of villages in the region, including Saint-les-Alpes, Orsay and La Vernay, all within a 20-kilometre radius of Din. So in terms of the actual impact point, clearly we're still waiting to get confirmation. But we do know that French emergency rescue officials are using helicopters to access the region because it is so remote and mountainous, and still there's a lot of snow around. However, one thing in their favour is that the weather is relatively good, the cloud level is not that low, so it's easy to sort of search the area and get a sense of where to go in terms of locating debris. And of course it's clear at this stage that sadly it is a salvage and not a rescue operation as such. Now, the French government has established a crisis unit in the region. They are working in conjunction with German aviation officials as well as people from Airbus and other people to try and work very hard and very quickly to establish the location of that black box, because, you know, the big question is why. As we were hearing from an aviation expert earlier, it could take a few days, but the unusual nature in which the rate and speed with which this plane came down, the fact that despite initial confusion at the beginning there was no distress call issued, gives you some indication that obviously it was a very serious situation, that the pilots were working very hard to stabilise the plane, but the odds were obviously clearly against them.
Yeah, it's very tricky terrain that they're operating in. We're understanding that they're looking at the reconnaissance photographs. You can see there's snow on the ground. They're at high altitude. We've had officials here in France saying that much of that area is very difficult to access with a land vehicle, hence the presence of helicopters that Annette was just talking about there. And I've seen pictures circulating online of a large lineup of fire engines and ambulances and so on. But we just don't know what distance they are, and they perhaps don't even know yet what distance they are from the actual main area of the crash site. But crash sites can be absolutely huge. It depends at which point the plane actually broke up. It could have broken up in midair. We don't know that yet for the time being. If it broke up in midair, the chances are that it's spread over a very large area. And one of the things that we can commonly expect in a situation where a plane has broken up in midair is that people will find in inhabited areas debris close to them, and it can cause fatalities on the ground. We haven't heard any reports of that. That doesn't mean it hasn't happened. It just means we haven't had those reports for the time being, because these are isolated areas. These are areas at high altitude in the French mountains, as we said, 150 kilometers or so from Nice, where of course they're on the sea level, but that's still a good way up in a mountainous region of France, and difficult for the authorities to access.
Can you remind us what we know about, Nata, about who was on board?
We know for the time being, originally we were told there were 142 passengers on board. That's been revised upwards to 144, plus 6 crew. We can assume 2 pilots, 4 cabin crew. 4 cabin crew is fairly typical nowadays on a low-cost carrier, where they'll have 1 crew member per emergency exit on the plane, not more than that, because that's the minimum that's required by law, by safety requirements that go with these aircraft manuals. So that's quite standard. On more premium airlines, on long-haul flights, you can expect there to be more crew than that, but 4 would be standard in that they would be serving just a light snack during the course of the flight. So that's who we know about who was on board. We don't yet know the identities of the pilot and the captain. That's a very important detail when you're looking at root causes of plane accidents, because very often you're impressed by the number of flying hours that pilot has had. If it's a very experienced pilot, for example, the pilot who landed that plane on the Hudson River back in 2009 had so many flying hours. He did the almost impossible, which is to land a plane on water. That very rarely happens successfully. So we don't yet know the identity or the level of experience of the pilots.
Tom, one thing that's interesting, which has emerged in the last 30 minutes, is the fact we got confirmation that the pilot didn't make a distress call, which is sort of clearly sort of pointing towards some sort of mid-air collision, if that explosion rather, if that was the case. Because certainly if there was a situation where he was able to be in contact with air traffic control, there would have been some moments there where, the plane was still, its integrity had not been damaged as such.
It's interesting what you say, Annette, because I've looked at the dialogue and the transcript of conversations between pilots and ground control in a number of accidents. For example, the Concorde accident back in 2000 at Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport, and that accident resulted in the deaths of more than 100 people on board that Concorde. And the transcript is extremely short. The pilot is in panic mode. The priorities he has are right before him, and someone talking to him in his ear, who's in the control tower, somehow is not at the forefront of his list of things that he needs to attend to immediately. And in that particular case, in the case of the Concorde crash, they were close to the ground when it happened. It may have been factors on the ground that caused that crash, but the dialogue is almost non-existent. Monosyllabic words from the pilot, him saying no, negative, yes, and that's almost the extent of it. What you're saying and the absence of that distress call could point to one of the theories that we've heard about already from aviation experts, some sort of a loss of cabin pressure, which deprived the cockpit of oxygen. This sort of thing remarkably does happen. Anecdotally, I was hearing at the weekend about a situation involving another airline whereby the cabin had an oxygen problem. And therefore the plane was delayed for several hours. Now, I'd never heard that before, but it is beginning to point towards there was some sort of a situation on board that plane involving the air supply, because why else wouldn't the pilot have spoken to ground control? And the other point is that if this had been a pilot flying under duress, perhaps a pilot who'd been forced to reroute the plane under the duress perhaps of an attack on board the plane, we would have heard about it by now. Those people who had the agenda, who orchestrated that, would have by now come out and said that it was they who were behind it. So it's interesting what this is pointing towards, and what I think we're going to hear more and more about is some sort of a technical issue, some sort of an instrument failure, which could in turn have triggered another series of events, such as a catastrophic loss of pressure or air supply inside the aircraft cabin.
An aviation expert was telling us before that it could be something to do with probes, and if it were, this wouldn't be the first time for Lufthansa.
No, and we've heard here in France, we've had the situation with the speed sensors on board that A330, which Air France operated on that flight from Rio to Paris, 447, back a few years ago, which Annette was just talking about. And that was one of the issues there, frozen speed sensors giving the pilot a false sense of what speed they were flying at, and the aircraft stalled midair and plunged into the sea is the agreed theory as to what happened there. What's interesting here is you've got this aircraft doing unusual things in terms of its altitude. I just put that question to an aviation expert a moment ago, and he seemed to believe that it was strange, the trajectory the plane had in terms of its altitude in its final moments in the air, and this could point towards, as you say, some sort of a technical issue with the probes which measure altitude in midair, and given that it's a mountainous region, that's a very hazardous situation to be in if you don't know what altitude you're flying at.
But of course, one of the things that came out of that Air France crash in 2009 was ongoing concerns about the increasing computerisation of cockpits and pilots' ability to override a computer's instructions.
Indeed, planes are increasingly computerized. Autopilots do exactly what they say, what the label says. It is a computer system that takes over control of the aircraft. And these instruments on board the plane are reliable. They're good instruments. There are, as we've been saying, 3,600 Airbus A320s in the air being used by a whole host of airlines across the globe. And these incidents are very, very unusual. But no system is infallible. There are technical issues with modern technology. They don't always serve us 100%. There can be inaccuracies. There can be malfunctions. There could have been interference in those instruments triggered by another event. We hear a lot about people not using mobile phones in flight because they interfere with aircraft instruments. We hear that announcement all the time. Now, there are obviously various theories as to whether or not there's anything to be worried about in that particular case with the use of a mobile phone, but we are given to understand these instruments are sensitive to various types of interference, whether it's freezing up, as was the case of the speed sensors on AF447, or whether it's, in this case, perhaps, as I say perhaps, this is huge amount of speculation at this stage, the altitude monitors perhaps not working as they should have done, but we don't know for what reason.